For 20 years. No doctor could cure. The CEO's paralysis. A single dad delivery driver changed everything. The left leg stopped working on a Wednesday morning in February. Marcus Cole was standing at the head of a glass conference table on the 31st floor of a building he owned, mid-sentence, pointing at a revenue chart, when his left leg simply stopped. Not a cramp, not a stumble. It was as if someone had quietly cut a wire somewhere deep inside him, and the signal that had always traveled from his brain to his knee had vanished without warning. He did not fall. He pulled the chair toward him with one hand, sat down, and finished the presentation. His voice did not waver. His hands stayed steady on the table. When the investors asked questions, he answered every one. When they shook his hand at the door, nobody knew. Not a single person in that room suspected that Marcus Cole had just lost something he would spend the next 20 years trying to get back. That was 2003. By then, Marcus had already built what most people spend a lifetime chasing. He had grown up in a small house in Cincinnati, with a father who repaired televisions and a mother who cleaned hotel rooms on the night shift. There were no business connections in his family, no inherited wealth, no one who knew how to open doors in corporate America. What he had was a mind that would not stop working, and a stubbornness that most people mistook for arrogance, until they realized it was actually something closer to faith. Faith that if he worked longer than everyone else, if he thought harder, if he refused to accept the word no as a final answer, something would eventually give way. It did. He started his logistics company, Meridian Freight Solutions, with a folding table, a second-hand laptop, and one client who needed packages moved between 3 warehouses in the Chicago area. He slept 4 hours a night for the first 3 years. He drove the trucks himself sometimes, in the early days, because he could not yet afford to hire enough drivers. He ate sandwiches in parking lots and read contracts under the light of his phone. He made mistakes that cost him money he did not have. He corrected them. He made more mistakes. He corrected those too. By 2001, he had 40 employees. By 2003, he had 340, a fleet of vehicles, contracts with 4 major retailers, and an office on the 31st floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, with a view of Lake Michigan that turned gold in the mornings. He had everything. And then the leg stopped working. The first doctor called it stress-related muscle fatigue. He recommended rest. Marcus rested for 2 days, decided that was sufficient, and went back to work. The leg did not improve. He went back to the doctor. The doctor sent him to a neurologist. The neurologist ran tests. The tests came back with numbers and abbreviations that meant very little to Marcus, who was accustomed to understanding everything placed in front of him. He asked for clarification. The neurologist explained that there appeared to be some disruption in the signal pathway between his spinal cord and his lower limbs, possibly connected to a car accident Marcus had survived in 1998, a collision on the I-90 that had seemed minor at the time. He had walked away from it, or so he had believed. The neurologist referred him to a second neurologist. The second referred him to a third. The third suggested a specialist at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Marcus flew there on a Tuesday and flew back on a Thursday with a diagnosis that sat somewhere between primary lateral sclerosis and an incomplete spinal cord injury, a gray zone that no one could map precisely, because his case did not fit neatly into any single box. Medicine, Marcus discovered, was uncomfortable with things that did not fit into boxes. Over the years that followed, the weakness spread. The right leg became unreliable by 2005. By 2007, Marcus was using a cane. By 2009, the cane was no longer enough. He spent 6 months fighting himself before he accepted the motorized wheelchair. He fought it the way he had fought every obstacle in his life, with logic, with research, with the persistent belief that there had to be a solution he had not yet found. He found many solutions. None of them worked. He tried a stem cell treatment in Guadalajara in 2011 that cost him $190,000. He spent 6 weeks in a clinic that smelled of antiseptic and optimism, undergoing injections that left him exhausted and nauseated in ways he had never experienced. He flew home lighter than he had arrived, and not in any way that mattered. He tried an experimental nerve stimulation program in Munich in 2014. He tried a treatment protocol developed at a university in South Korea in 2016. He corresponded with researchers. He funded studies, he donated to foundations, he sat in offices across 3 continents and listened to brilliant people explain, with varying degrees of gentleness, that they were sorry, that the science was not there yet, that they hoped, in time, things might improve. Things did not improve. What Marcus Cole had instead of improvement was adaptation. He adapted with the same ferocity he had applied to building his company. He had his office redesigned so that every surface could be reached from his chair. He had his home in Lincoln Park retrofitted with ramps and wider doorways, and a shower he could access without help, because help was something he accepted from his employees and his doctors, but not in his own bathroom. He hired people who were better than him at the things he could no longer do physically, which freed him to do the things he could still do better than almost everyone: think, decide, negotiate, lead. The company grew. By 2015, Meridian Freight Solutions had over 1,000 employees and had expanded into 4 states. By 2020, they were operating nationally. Business journalists wrote pieces about Marcus Cole that used words like inspiring and resilient, and Marcus read them in the early morning, before anyone arrived at the office and felt something complicated that was not quite pride and not quite irritation. He understood why people wrote those things. He also understood that the word resilient was sometimes used by people who had never been asked to be. What the journalists did not write about, because Marcus did not tell them, was the pain. It had been there since 2005, a slow, persistent presence that lived in the lower half of his body like something that had moved in without asking. It was not the kind of pain that announced itself with drama. It did not spike and retreat. It was simply always there, at varying intensities, through every meeting and every flight and every phone call and every dinner. The medications his doctors prescribed took the edge off, without removing the thing underneath. He had learned to carry it the way a person learns to carry something heavy when there is no table to set it down on. You adjust your grip. You keep walking, or in his case, you keep moving forward, in the chair, with the weight of it invisible to everyone around you. He had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 11 years. He had not told a single person that. His assistant, a precise and capable woman named Greta, had worked for him for 9 years and had never once heard him complain about his condition. His board of directors knew the facts of it, the medical summary, the limitations, in the same way they knew his quarterly projections, as data. He preferred it that way. Data could be assessed and managed. Everything else was noise. By the winter of 2022, Marcus Cole was 52 years old, worth more money than he could spend in 4 lifetimes, and quietly more exhausted than he had ever been in his life. He had tried everything that medicine had put in front of him. He had spent time, money, hope, and years on treatments that had collectively delivered nothing measurable. He was a man who believed in solutions, who had built a career on finding them, and who had arrived, somewhere in the gray middle of his 50s, at the nearest thing to defeat he had ever known. He did not show it. He sat in his chair in his 31st floor office and made decisions and answered emails and ran a company that moved freight across the country. He ate the meals Greta scheduled for him. He attended the appointments his doctor's assistant booked. He read books about neurology in the evenings because knowledge, even when it produced no outcome, was the one thing that still felt like action. He watched the lake from his office window on the days when Chicago gave you a sky worth watching. He did not know that on a Tuesday morning in February of 2023, a man named Darnell was going to knock on his door with 17 bags of organic groceries and a purple hair tie on his wrist. He did not know that the thing he had been looking for across 20 years and 3 continents had been living 11 miles south of him, in a neighborhood his company's trucks passed through every single day. He did not know any of that. All he knew, sitting in his office that winter, was that the pain was still there, the sleep would not come, and he had run out of people to call. He had no idea that the right person was about to find him first. The doorbell at Marcus Cole's Lincoln Park home rang at 6:03 in the morning. This was not unusual. Marcus had arranged his grocery deliveries for early morning precisely because it was the only part of the day when he was certain he would be awake. He had been awake since 3:15, which was also not unusual. He had spent the hours between 3 and 6 reading a journal article about axonal regeneration, a topic he understood better than most people who had never attended medical school, purely because 20 years of having a condition gave a person either the choice to become fluent in it or to remain confused by it. Marcus had chosen fluency. He wheeled to the front door and opened it. The man on the other side was not what he expected. This was not a reflection on the man. It was simply that Marcus, after 9 years of the same grocery service, had formed an unconscious picture of what a delivery driver at 6 in the morning looked like, and Darnell Ware did not match it. He was perhaps 38, and short, with the kind of physical build that came not from a gym but from years of carrying things. He had a calm face, not blank, but still, the way a person's face gets still when they have learned that reacting to things quickly is usually a waste of energy. He was wearing a dark jacket with the delivery company's logo on the chest, and on his left wrist, visible when he reached forward with the first set of bags, was a purple hair tie. The elastic was worn. It had been stretched many times. He wore it like it was not something he had chosen to wear today, but something that was simply part of him, the way a wedding band becomes part of a person after long enough. "Morning," Darnell said. His voice was low and unhurried. 17 items. Got a cold bag in here for the salmon, so I'll leave that on top." Marcus moved his chair back to allow room in the doorway. The chair caught. It was a mechanical problem that occurred perhaps twice a month, a small metal casing on the left wheel that sat just low enough to snag on the brass lip of the door threshold. Marcus had a repair technician who came quarterly. In between visits, he had developed a system involving a specific backward angle and a slight rightward turn that usually freed it within 30 seconds. It did not free it in 30 seconds this time. He worked at it without speaking, because this was a private frustration, and he did not perform frustration for audiences. Darnell set the bags down on the step without being asked. He did not offer unsolicited commentary. He did not make the face, the particular arrangement of eyebrows and mouth that people made when they saw Marcus struggling with something and wanted to help, but were afraid of saying the wrong thing. He simply waited, and then, after a moment, crouched down beside the wheel without asking, looked at the casing, pressed 2 fingers against a specific point on the frame, and the wheel came free. He stood back up. "It catches on the lip," Darnell said, not as explanation, but as simple observation, the way a person states a fact about weather. "The casing sits about 3 millimeters too low. You can get a spacer put in. Takes about 10 minutes. Marcus looked at him. "You know wheelchairs," Marcus said. Darnell picked up the grocery bags. "Used to fix them, among other things." He said it the way people say things they have decided not to make a big deal of. Marcus, who had built a company partly on the skill of knowing when a sentence contained more than its words, held the door open and said, "Come in and set those on the counter." Darnell came in. He moved through the space with the awareness of someone accustomed to entering homes that were not his own, setting things down carefully, not touching anything he did not need to touch. He placed the bags on the kitchen island, with the cold bag on top as promised, and he was turning to leave when Marcus said, "What other things?" Darnell stopped. "You said you fixed wheelchairs among other things," Marcus said. "What were the other things?" There was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In Marcus's experience, people paused before answers for different reasons. Some paused because they were deciding whether to lie. Some paused because they were surprised by the question. Some paused because they were deciding how much of the true answer to give. Darnell's pause was the third kind. "I ran a clinic," Darnell said. "Physical rehabilitation. Neuromuscular cases specifically. South Shore neighborhood. For about 6 years. Marcus said nothing. He waited. He had learned early in his career that silence was the most productive thing you could offer someone who was deciding how much to say. "Specialized in what I guess you'd call nerve pathway recovery," Darnell continued. "Not the standard approach. I developed something over time. Started because my ex-wife had a nerve condition. Degenerative. She was a dancer. She was 29 when it started, and nobody was doing anything for her that was actually working. So I started reading. And then I started trying things. And then some of the things I tried worked." "What happened to the clinic?" Marcus asked. Another pause, shorter this time. "Insurance wouldn't cover the treatment, because I didn't have the right papers behind my name. I had a 2-year degree in physical therapy, and 6 years of results, but results don't count for much when the forms aren't filled in the right boxes. He said this without bitterness, which was somehow more striking than if he had said it bitterly. Malpractice insurance ate the rest. I closed it in 2020. Marcus had, in 20 years, sat across from neurologists with publications in the New England Journal of Medicine. He had sat across from researchers at Johns Hopkins and the Cleveland Clinic. He had sat across from a German specialist whose waiting list was 3 years long. He had learned, in all those rooms, to listen for the particular quality of a person who knew exactly what they were talking about. It was not about vocabulary or credentials. It was something in the specific weight of the words, the way someone described a mechanism versus the way someone summarized what they had read about a mechanism. Darnell Ware spoke about nerve pathways the way Marcus spoke about supply chain logistics. From the inside. "Do you still have your equipment?" Marcus asked. Darnell looked at him directly for the first time. He had careful eyes, dark and steady, and he looked at Marcus the way someone looks at a question they were not expecting. "Why?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was more like a door held slightly open. Marcus said, "Because I have a neuromuscular condition that 17 doctors across 4 countries have been unable to do anything meaningful about. I have had it for 20 years. I have limited sensation and movement in both legs. I have chronic pain that does not respond well to medication. I am not asking you to fix me. I am asking whether what you did in that clinic is something that still exists, or whether it ended when the clinic did." Darnell was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the purple hair tie on his wrist in a way that was not intentional, just the habit of a person who returns to a small object when thinking. Then he looked back at Marcus. "My daughter's name is Amara," he said. "She's 10. She lives in Atlanta with her mother. I send money every month. I do 4 delivery routes a day, 6 days a week. I have the equipment in a storage unit on Cermak Road because I could not bring myself to sell it." He paused. "I haven't used it in 3 years. Marcus said, "I'm not asking you for charity, and I'm not offering it. I'm asking if you're willing to try." "On what terms?" Darnell asked. "Whatever terms you set," Marcus said. "You know what you're doing. I don't. That means you set the terms." Darnell looked at him for another moment. Then he said, "I'd need to come 3 mornings a week, early, before my first route. I'd need to assess you properly before I touch anything. And I need you to understand that what I do is not comfortable and it is not fast. If you're expecting quick results, you'll be disappointed." "I've been waiting 20 years, Marcus said. "I'm not in a hurry." Darnell nodded once. He picked up his empty delivery bag from the floor and folded it under his arm. "Thursday," he said, 5:45. He walked to the front door, stepped over the threshold without looking down, and left. Marcus sat in his kitchen for a long time after the door closed. The grocery bags sat on the island. The morning was beginning to come through the windows, a thin gray light off the lake. He had not felt the particular sensation now moving through his chest in a very long time. It took him a few minutes to identify it. It was something close to hope. He did not trust it yet. He had trusted it before, in better-equipped rooms than this, with more credentialed people than a delivery driver who kept a worn hair tie on his wrist. He had been let down by hope in Munich, and in Guadalajara, and in a research hospital in Seoul, with spotless floors and equipment that cost more than his first company. But there had been something in Darnell's voice. Not promise, not sales, just the specific gravity of a person who had spent years doing something real. Marcus wheeled to the counter, unpacked the salmon from the cold bag, and put it in the refrigerator. Thursday, he thought, 5:45. He had waited 20 years. 2 more days would not kill him. 5:45 on Thursday morning. Marcus opened the front door to find Darnell already there. Not knocking, not waiting with his hand raised, just standing on the step, a rolling case beside him, a paper cup of coffee in one hand, looking at the sky the way people look when they are not thinking about anything in particular, and are at peace with that. He was wearing the same dark jacket. The purple hair tie was still on his wrist. "You're early," Marcus said. "I'm always early," Darnell said, and walked in. He spent the first 40 minutes doing nothing that felt like treatment. He asked Marcus questions. Not the questions Marcus had been asked 100 times before in clinical settings. The numbered pain scales and the tapping hammers on the knees and the "do you feel this, do you feel that?" He asked different questions. He asked what the pain felt like at 3 in the morning versus what it felt like at noon. He asked whether there was any sensation at all below the knee or whether it was purely absence. He asked about the 1998 accident, not the official account of it, but what Marcus remembered from inside the car in the seconds before the collision, which muscles had braced, which way his body had turned. Marcus answered everything. He had never been asked those particular questions before, and the act of answering them was strange. Not uncomfortable, but strange. The way it is strange to describe something you have always lived with but never named. Then Darnell opened the rolling case and began. The first session lasted 50 minutes. It involved his hands and a small device that Darnell described as a low-frequency nerve stimulator, a machine about the size of a hardback book with leads that attached to specific points along Marcus's lower back and thighs. Darnell worked methodically and without much talking. His hands moved over the nerve clusters of Marcus's lower back with a precision that was entirely unlike any physical therapy Marcus had experienced, which had mostly felt like being needed in ways designed to be comfortable. What Darnell did was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to find specific things. He found them. There were moments in that first session when Marcus gripped the arms of the chair hard enough that his knuckles went pale. Not because Darnell was being rough, but because he was finding places that had not been touched in a long time, nerve points that had essentially been left alone by every other practitioner because they were difficult to access, and because touching them produced exactly the reaction Marcus was producing now. Most clinicians had backed away from that reaction. Darnell did not back away. He simply watched Marcus's face, adjusted the pressure by a fraction, waited, and continued. When it was over, Marcus felt scraped clean in a way he could not fully describe. Exhausted, and strangely lighter at the same time. "That's the baseline," Darnell said, packing up the equipment with the same methodical care he had used to unpack it. "Now I know what I'm working with." "And what are you working with?" Marcus asked. Darnell thought for a moment. "You have more pathway than anyone's told you. The signals are there. They're just being blocked in a few specific places. Whether we can clear those blockages enough to get meaningful function back, I don't know. But the pathway isn't gone." He paused. "Nobody ever looked at this specific set of points. I could see that from how your body responded. They went around them." "Why would they go around them?" Marcus asked. "Because accessing them is uncomfortable, and the response is hard to read if you don't know what you're looking for." He zipped the case. "I know what I'm looking for." That was the beginning. Over the weeks that followed, a routine formed. Darnell arrived at 5:45 3 mornings a week. He came through the front door like someone who had keys to the place, which he did not. But the punctuality and the quiet self-possession of his arrival gave the impression that he belonged there, which, increasingly, he did. He drank the coffee Marcus's machine made and set the cup on the kitchen counter before moving to the guest room Marcus had cleared for the sessions. The sessions grew longer and harder. Darnell worked on a sequence of nerve points that he had mapped across the first 3 weeks, a specific geography of Marcus's lower spine and legs that he navigated with the confidence of a person reading a familiar road. He did not explain everything he was doing in real time, not because he was withholding, but because he was concentrating, and Marcus, who understood what concentration looked like, did not ask him to stop and explain while his hands were working. The explanations came after, over coffee, in the kitchen, with the early Chicago light coming through the windows. Darnell talked about his ex-wife during those morning conversations. Her name was Pauline. She had been a contemporary dancer with a company in Chicago, and the condition that had ended her career had started as numbness in her right hand, which everyone initially attributed to nerve compression. By the time the correct diagnosis came, she had lost most of the fine motor function in her right hand and her right foot. The treatment protocol Darnell had developed had not reversed her condition, but it had slowed its progression and restored enough function in her foot that she could walk without assistance, which her neurologist had said was unlikely. They had separated 3 years after her diagnosis, not because of the condition, because of the things that conditions bring with them, the weight of them distributed unevenly between 2 people, until the distribution becomes impossible to sustain. Amara had been 7 when they separated. Pauline had moved to Atlanta to be near her family. Darnell had stayed in Chicago because his mother was here, and because leaving felt, to him, like a kind of failure he was not ready to accept. He did not describe any of this with self-pity. He described it the way he described nerve pathways, as a series of events with causes and effects, none of which he had chosen entirely, all of which he had to work with. Month 2 was harder than month 1. There were sessions where the work produced a pain response in Marcus that was acute and sudden, and those were the sessions where Darnell spoke while he worked, not to distract, but to give Marcus something to focus on outside his own body. He talked about Amara. She was building a science fair project about nerve regeneration in earthworms, a choice she had made independently at age 10 after asking Darnell why nerves could not just grow back when they were damaged. He had explained that some could and some could not, and that scientists were trying to understand how to help the ones that could not. She had found this unacceptable, and had decided to investigate it herself. Darnell described her laboratory method, which involved a kitchen table, a microscope borrowed from her school, and a level of organizational rigor that he said had not come from him. Marcus listened to these descriptions the way he listened to things he found unexpectedly interesting, which was attentively, without performing it. There was a session in week 7, when Marcus told Darnell to stop, not because of the pain, because of something underneath the pain, a feeling he had not anticipated, and had not prepared himself for. Darnell's work had begun to reach nerve pathways that had been silent for years, and the process of those pathways reawakening was not entirely physical. It brought with it a rush of something that Marcus could not categorize. Not grief exactly, not relief. Something between the two. The feeling of returning to a place you had been told you could never go back to. He said, "Stop, just for a minute." Darnell stopped immediately. He sat back and waited. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not fill the silence. Marcus sat with his hands on his thighs for 2 minutes. The light in the room was early and gray. Outside, a truck moved down the street. He could hear his own breathing. Then he said, "All right, continue." Darnell continued. Month 3 arrived, and did not bring the improvement Marcus had quietly started watching for. This was the part he had feared, the part where, as with everything before, the initial feeling of possibility settled into the familiar reality of no change. He knew this territory. He had lived in it before. He told Darnell not to come on a Monday morning. Darnell came anyway. He sat in the kitchen and made his own coffee and read something on his phone. After 40 minutes, Marcus came out of his bedroom and found him there and said nothing. He went to the guest room. Darnell followed. The session that morning was quiet. Neither of them spoke. At the end of it, Darnell packed up his case and said, "It doesn't move in straight lines. What we're doing, it moves in ways you can't always see yet." Marcus said, "How do you know it's moving?" Darnell said, "Because your responses in the last 3 sessions are different from your responses in week 1. You can't feel the difference because you're inside it. I can see it from outside." Marcus said nothing to that. But he did not tell Darnell to stop coming. The weeks after that were different in a quality Marcus found difficult to name. Not easier, but less like pushing against a wall that did not move, and more like pushing against something that had some give in it, some response, some indication that the force was landing somewhere. Month 4, month 5 approaching. And then one morning, on a Tuesday in the 5th month of their arrangement, in the gray guest room of the Lincoln Park house with the lake somewhere beyond the windows and a Chicago wind moving outside, something happened. Darnell was working on a nerve cluster at the base of Marcus's left calf. He had been working on this specific cluster twice a week for 3 months. It had not, in all that time, produced anything Marcus could feel voluntarily on his side of the nerve. And then it did. Marcus's left foot moved, intentionally, half an inch. Not a spasm, not an involuntary reflex, an intended movement, originating from him, traveling down a pathway that had been dark for years. He and Darnell both saw it. Neither of them spoke for a very long time. The room was quiet. The wind moved outside. Marcus stared at his left foot on the footrest of the chair, as though it had done something he was not fully prepared to believe. Then Marcus looked at Darnell, and Darnell, who had the still face of a person who did not react to things quickly, was not still. He was sitting with his hands clasped, and his eyes bright, and an expression on his face that had something of Amara in it. Marcus thought, the specific look of someone who has believed in something they could not entirely prove, and has just watched the world catch up to them. Marcus said, "What do you need?" Darnell looked at him. "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean," Marcus said carefully, "that what you have done here, in this room, with a machine in a rolling case in your hands, is more than 20 years of medicine has given me. And I want to know what it would take to give that to more people. What do you need to do that?" The room was quiet again. Darnell looked down at the purple hair tie on his wrist. He was thinking, and Marcus let him think. And outside the Chicago wind moved past the window, and the morning was beginning in earnest, and neither of them was in a hurry. The answer Darnell gave that morning was not the one Marcus had expected. He had expected a number. He had sat across from enough people over enough years to know that when you asked someone what they needed, the answer was usually financial, and it would have been fine if it had been. Marcus had spent $190,000 on a treatment in Guadalajara that had done nothing. He was prepared to spend considerably more on something that was clearly working. But Darnell did not give him a number. He said, "I need people to take it seriously." Marcus looked at him. "The money isn't the main problem," Darnell continued. "The main problem is that nobody in a position to make this a real treatment takes it seriously, because I don't have the right letters after my name. I have a 2-year physical therapy degree and 6 years of documented results, and the documented results don't count because the documentation wasn't done in a room that the right people recognize." He paused. "Money buys equipment. Money buys space. Money doesn't buy the conversation I need to be in. That's what I need. Someone who can get me into a room where people will actually listen." Marcus said, "I know which room." He made one phone call that afternoon. The person he called was Dr. Patricia Nguyen. She ran the Neurology Research Division at Northwestern University. She was 61, published in more journals than Marcus could name, and she had the precise kind of institutional credibility that Darnell lacked. She had also, Marcus knew from a mutual contact, been quietly interested for years in non-pharmaceutical approaches to neuromuscular recovery, a field that her more traditional colleagues regarded with polite skepticism. She had not published in this area because the evidence was thin and the methods were difficult to standardize. She had watched the field from the edge of it. Marcus told her about Darnell. Not everything. Enough. Patricia listened without interrupting, which, Marcus knew, was the sign of a scientist who had heard something that interested her. When he finished, she said, "Send him to me." Marcus told Darnell that evening. Darnell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's the one who sent me an email in 2019, telling me my methodology wasn't supported by peer-reviewed evidence, and that I should reconsider offering it to patients." Marcus said, "I know." Another pause. "She want to see me, or does she want to evaluate me?" Darnell asked. "I think she wants to do both," Marcus said, "and I think she's smart enough to know the difference between the two." The meeting at Northwestern happened on a Thursday morning in April. Marcus came with Darnell, not to speak for him, but because Darnell had asked him to come, and Marcus understood that what he was being asked to do was simply be present, a physical statement that someone of significance had seen what Darnell had done and was willing to stand in the same room with it. Patricia Nguyen had 3 graduate students in the room. She had not told them what the meeting was about. They sat along one side of a long table with notebooks open, and the alert, slightly anxious energy of people who were good at their work and knew it. Darnell sat across from Patricia and explained what he did. He explained it without apology, and without overselling. He described the nerve pathway mapping process. He described the specific stimulation technique he had developed, and how it differed from standard electrical stimulation therapy. He described the biofeedback component, and why he believed it was essential to the approach. He described his results across the 6 years of the clinic, 43 patients, documented with the rigor of someone who had known, even without academic affiliation, that the documentation would matter someday. The graduate students were taking notes before he finished his second sentence. Patricia asked questions. Good questions, technical ones. The kind that can only be asked by someone who deeply understands the field. Darnell answered each of them. Not defensively, not with the stiffness of someone trying to impress, with the directness of someone who had lived inside this material for a long time and was simply describing what he had found there. At the end of 2 hours, Patricia put her pen down. She said, "You have something here. I don't know how much of something yet, but there's something." She paused. "I'd like to run a formal pilot study. 12 participants, 6 months, properly documented. If the results hold, we can talk about a larger trial." Darnell said, "I have one condition." Patricia looked at him. "The community where I built this protocol gets first access to whatever comes from the study," he said. "Before academic publishing, before clinical rollout. The people in South Shore who used this treatment when I had the clinic, and the people who couldn't access it after I closed. They get priority. That's the condition." There was a pause. Patricia said, "That's a reasonable condition." She did not look surprised, which told Marcus she had already thought about this before he arrived. Agreed. They shook hands. Marcus, in the back of the room, said nothing. He had not needed to say anything. He had simply needed to be in the room, and Darnell had done everything else. The pilot study began in June. 12 participants were selected from Northwestern's neurology patient database and from a South Shore community health clinic that Darnell knew well, because he had sent patients there when they could not afford the fees at his clinic. The participants ranged in age from 27 to 64 and had varying forms of progressive neuromuscular impairment. Darnell treated each of them using his protocol, now formally documented and approved by Northwestern's ethics board. Marcus continued his own sessions during this period. The progress that had begun with the movement of his left foot in month 5 had continued, slowly and unevenly, in the months that followed. He was not experiencing recovery in the way he had imagined it over 20 years of hoping, a gradual and steady return of what he had lost. It was more irregular than that. Some weeks brought noticeable changes. Some weeks brought nothing. But the trajectory, over time, was not ambiguous. He had more sensation in both legs than he had had since 2007. The pain, which had been a constant presence for years, had diminished in duration, if not entirely in intensity. He was sleeping, not perfectly, but in longer stretches than before. His doctor, a careful and methodical internist named Charles who had managed Marcus's condition for 12 years, reviewed him in September and said, with the measured understatement of someone who did not believe in dramatic statements, that the changes were difficult to explain by any factor other than the treatment. Marcus said, "They're not difficult to explain. I can introduce you to the person who can explain them." He introduced Charles to Darnell at a lunch in October. Charles asked Darnell questions for 2 hours, and then went home and read everything Darnell had told him to read. A week later, Charles called Marcus and said he thought Darnell's approach had a genuine theoretical basis that had simply been overlooked by the mainstream of his field. Marcus said, "I know." Amara flew in from Atlanta in November for a weekend visit. She arrived with a backpack that was almost as big as she was, and an expression of purposeful assessment, like someone arriving somewhere they had been thinking about for a long time. She was 10 years old, and she moved through Marcus's house with the kind of quiet confidence that children have when they are not nervous around adults because they have had good reason to trust them. She greeted Marcus with a handshake. "My dad told me about you," she said. "What did he tell you?" Marcus asked. "He said you were stubborn," she said, "and that was actually useful in this case." Marcus looked at Darnell over her head. Darnell shrugged, which was as close to embarrassed as Marcus had ever seen him. That Saturday, Amara sat in the kitchen while Darnell explained the treatment protocol to her in response to questions she had brought on a handwritten list. She had a notebook. She wrote things down. When he used a term she did not know, she asked him to define it, and wrote the definition. When she did not understand his explanation, she told him so and asked him to try a different way. Marcus, who had conducted thousands of business meetings over 20 years, watched this and thought that Amara was going to be formidable. That was the specific word that came to mind. Formidable. The pilot study results came in the following spring. 9 of the 12 participants demonstrated measurable improvement. 3 were classified as clinically significant, meaning the improvement was substantial enough to meet the threshold for what the medical establishment considered meaningful recovery. 2 participants showed no measurable change. These were not miracle numbers. They were not the numbers of a cure. They were, however, the numbers of something real, something reproducible, something that could be built on. Patricia Wynne said so in the meeting where they reviewed the results, and she said it in the particular tone of a scientist who does not allow herself to be easily excited and is currently somewhat excited. The paper was prepared over the following months. It was submitted to a neurological research journal in August. It was accepted with revisions in October. When it was published in December, it listed Darnell Ware as the primary architect of the protocol in the author credits. Not a contributor, not a consultant. The primary architect. Darnell had requested that wording. Patricia had agreed without argument. Marcus had not needed to say anything about it, which was how he preferred things. The day the paper went online, Marcus printed a copy. He did not frame it or make a thing of it. He simply read it at his kitchen counter with his morning coffee, standing, with his cane leaned against the counter beside him. Standing. He had not stood at a kitchen counter to read something in over a decade. He finished the paper, set it down, and looked out the window at the lake. It was a gray December morning, the kind Chicago delivers without apology. The water was flat and dark. A cargo ship was moving on the far horizon, slow and steady, carrying something from somewhere to somewhere else. Marcus Cole watched it until it passed out of sight. He did not call anyone. He did not need to. The press conference was not Marcus's idea. It was Patricia Wynne's, and he had resisted it for 3 weeks before he agreed, and he had agreed only because Darnell asked him to. Not directly. Darnell was not someone who made direct requests of people who had more institutional power than he did, because he had learned that such requests created a kind of debt he was not comfortable with. But he had said, one morning in January, that he thought it would help the community health clinic in South Shore if there was something official attached to the study, something that gave it weight in a public way. Marcus had understood what he was being asked. He said yes the same day. The press conference was held at Northwestern in February. It was not large. 14 journalists, a handful of academic representatives, Patricia and her team, Darnell, and Marcus. Marcus had asked Greta to keep the media list tight. He did not want a spectacle. He wanted a clear, honest statement of what had happened and what it meant. Patricia spoke first. She was precise and careful, as she always was, and she explained the study, its methodology, its results, and its limitations in language that was accessible without being simplified. She said that the protocol developed by Darnell Ware represented a genuinely novel approach to neuromuscular pathway stimulation, and that the results of the pilot study warranted serious attention from the research community. Then she introduced Darnell. Darnell had not prepared remarks. Marcus had suggested he might want to, and Darnell had said he did not feel comfortable with prepared remarks, because they sounded like prepared remarks when he delivered them. Marcus had accepted this. He knew a person who understood their own instrument. What Darnell said instead was simple. He said he had built this treatment because someone he loved was sick, and the existing options were not working, and he had decided that was not good enough. He said he had spent 6 years applying it to people in a neighborhood where access to specialist care was limited, and that those people had deserved the same results as people who could afford specialist care, and that he had tried to give it to them. He said the clinic had closed because he had run out of money, and that the people in South Shore who had relied on it had not gotten anything in its place, and that fixing that was the most important thing that could come from what was happening now. He said this last part looking at Patricia, not as a request but as a reminder of the agreement they had made. She nodded once. Then Marcus was introduced. A journalist in the third row, a woman named Diana who covered medical stories for a Chicago paper, asked Marcus what had changed for him personally. Marcus sat with the question for a moment. He said, "For 20 years I looked for people with the right credentials in the right institutions, because I believed that was where the answer would come from. I spent money and time, and a significant amount of hope, in rooms that were very well equipped and staffed by very qualified people." He paused. None of those rooms produced what a storage unit on Cermak Road produced, and I have had to think seriously about what that means. Diana asked, "What does it mean?" Marcus said, "It means I was looking in the wrong places. I was filtering for credentials when I should have been filtering for results. Those are not the same thing. They overlap very often, but when they don't, you have to be honest about which one matters." Another journalist asked Marcus whether he was walking again. He looked at the cane, leaning against the table beside him. "I use a cane," he said. "I may use it for the rest of my life. I am not cured. I want to be clear about that. What has happened is not a cure. It is a significant, measurable, documented improvement in function and quality of life that I did not experience in 20 years of treatment anywhere else." He paused. "At 52, with a condition I have had since my 30s, I will take significant, measurable, documented improvement." There was a quietness in the room that was not the quietness of disinterest. It was the other kind. In the second row, Darnell sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him. He was listening to Marcus speak with the expression of someone who has been paying very close attention for a long time and has learned to read a room by its silences as much as its sounds. Amara was sitting next to him. She had come in from Atlanta 2 days earlier and had spent both days asking Patricia's graduate students questions about the study, until at least one of them had said, laughing and slightly overwhelmed, that she was exhausting, which Amara had received as a compliment. She was wearing a blazer that was slightly too long in the sleeves. She had her notebook in her lap. She was writing in it. When the press conference ended and the journalists dispersed, Marcus moved through the room toward Darnell and Amara. He had something he wanted to say, and he was not sure it would come out right, which was unusual for him. He had spent 30 years in rooms where the correct thing to say was the most important thing, and he had rarely been uncertain of it. He stopped in front of Darnell. He said, "The study said what happened. The paper will say what happened. I want to say what happened." Darnell waited. Marcus said, "The morning you freed the wheel on my chair, you didn't ask permission. You didn't make a face. You just fixed it. And then you said you used to fix wheelchairs, among other things, and you said it like it wasn't interesting. But everything about the way you said it was interesting." He paused. "I made a decision in about 30 seconds based on almost nothing. I want you to know that it was the most important decision I have made in the last 20 years. Darnell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You gave me the room. That was the part I didn't have." "You had everything else," Marcus said. Darnell looked down, and then Marcus saw what he had not seen clearly before, standing this close, the purple hair tie on Darnell's wrist. He had seen it every morning for over a year. He had noticed it the very first day. The worn elastic, the color, the way Darnell wore it as though it were not a choice but a fact. He had never mentioned it. He said, "The hair tie." Darnell looked at his wrist. Amara, beside him, reached over without looking up from her notebook and straightened it automatically, the gesture of someone who had done this many times. "She gave it to me," Darnell said quietly. "Before she moved to Atlanta. She was 7. She said she wanted me to have something of hers so I wouldn't miss her so much." He paused. "It didn't work, but I kept it." The room was almost empty now. Somewhere in the hallway, journalists were talking, and equipment was being packed. Patricia was speaking to one of her graduate students near the door. Marcus looked at the hair tie, then at Darnell, then at Amara, who was still writing in her notebook with the focused composure of someone who intended to remember everything. He said, "What is she writing?" Darnell looked at his daughter. "She started a new project," he said. "She's been asking everyone on Patricia's team questions about pathway regeneration in humans. She wants to know if there is a way to map nerve recovery in real time, while it's happening." Marcus said, "How old is she?" 10, Darnell said. "She'll be 11 in March." Marcus thought about that. He thought about a 10-year-old sitting at a kitchen table with a borrowed microscope, deciding that something was unacceptable and that she would investigate it herself. He thought about the specific inheritance of that quality, its origin, who it had come from. He did not say any of this. Amara looked up from her notebook. "I have a question for you," she said to Marcus. "When you moved your foot that first time, the half-inch, what did it feel like?" Marcus considered the question. He had been asked many questions since February. He had not been asked that one. He said, "It felt like hearing a sound in a room that has been silent for a very long time. You're not sure at first if you actually heard it, but then you know you did." Amara wrote this down. She did not say thank you or comment on the answer. She simply wrote it down, carefully, and closed the notebook. Outside, Chicago was doing what it did in February, delivering cold without sentiment. Flat gray sky, wind off the lake that found every gap, the kind of morning that did not perform itself. Northwestern's building had a wide front entrance with 5 steps down to the sidewalk. Marcus had noted them when they arrived. He had taken the ramp to the left, which was the sensible thing, the correct thing. He used it now, when the last of the group moved toward the exit. He stopped at the top of the ramp. He looked at the 5 steps. Darnell stopped beside him. Marcus said, "I'm going to try the steps." Darnell said nothing. He stood close, not hovering, not reaching, just present. Marcus put the cane forward. He took the first step slowly, then the second. His left leg, the one that had not listened in over 20 years, took the third step on its own signal, slowly and imperfectly, but on its own. It took him a little over a minute to take 5 steps. He reached the sidewalk. A gust came off the lake and hit him in the face, and he stood there with the cold of it, and the February gray, and a cane in his hand, on a sidewalk, having just walked down 5 steps. He did not make a production of it. He simply stood there for a moment, breathing, and looked at the street. Then he started walking toward the car. Amara was already on the sidewalk. She had not watched the steps. She had her notebook in her hand, and was reading back over something she had written. Darnell fell into step beside Marcus, slightly to his left, close enough. They walked. Behind them, the door of the Northwestern building closed. Ahead, a cargo truck moved through the intersection, its side panel printed with the logo of a freight company, moving something from somewhere to somewhere else, unhurried and steady, the way things move when they have finally found the right road. The story had no clean ending, because real stories do not have clean endings. Darnell would build his clinic back, first in South Shore, then elsewhere, slowly, properly, with documentation and partnership, and the particular difficulty of doing things the right way. It would take years. Some of it would be frustrating. Some of it would fail in small ways before it succeeded in larger ones. Marcus would continue to use a cane. The pain would come and go. There would be better weeks and harder ones. He would remain honest about this in the interviews that followed, because he was constitutionally incapable of letting people believe in a version of his story that was tidier than the true one. Amara would turn 11 in March and would submit a science fair project on nerve pathway mapping that her teacher would describe, in writing, as unlike anything we have ever received from a student at this level. Darnell would read this and say nothing and sit with it quietly for a long time. And on the wrist of a man who had spent 6 years building something in a neighborhood nobody visited, who had delivered groceries for 3 years because the math of loving his daughter required it, who had arrived at a stranger's door at 6:03 in the morning with 17 bags and 2 careful hands and a worn hair tie on his wrist. On that wrist, the purple hair tie remained, stretched and faded and absolutely not going anywhere. Some things you keep because they didn't work. Some things you keep because they worked in the only way that mattered. And sometimes, on a gray February morning, on a sidewalk outside a university, walking slowly toward a waiting car with a cane, and a man who had once sat at the head of a glass table on the 31st floor of a building he owned, and quietly lost everything. Sometimes the difference between those two things is harder to find than you expected. And that, it turned out, was fine. That was more than fine. That was enough.